Good morning, everyone. This is Rebecca Strauss with Miller Johnson. Thank you for joining us for this morning's COVID-19 briefing. We are very excited this morning to be talking about vaccines, something that's obviously been on the news constantly for the past week or so. My colleague Sarah Willey likes to say that since the pandemic started, each week has kind of a theme, right, of what everyone is talking about and can't get enough of, and then the next week, often a new theme emerges. The theme this week is without a doubt, vaccines. We're doing this briefing in two parts. Today, we are talking to an expert in the field to talk about, frankly, the non-legal aspects of the vaccine, the questions that we know you all have, frankly, the questions we have too, but they are better answered, right, by someone that is an expert in the field. And we have an excellent guest with us this morning, Elizabeth Davenport, who will be our expert. Tomorrow will be part two, and that is the session that will get into the legal aspects of the vaccine. Okay, we know you all have lots of questions for that. We are lawyers after all, and you want our perspective on that. So try to hold those questions until tomorrow, and we will answer them all for you. We did get questions that folks sent in advance of this webinar. Some of them are going to be covered tomorrow. So if you had one of those questions, for instance, can we mandate our employees to get the vaccine, those sorts of things, we are going to cover all of that and more tomorrow. So let's get started now with Elizabeth Davenport, because she has a lot of information to share with us. So I don't want to hold off on introducing her any longer. Elizabeth is with OptiMed Health Partners. OptiMed is a local West Michigan company that has both a local and a national reach. They are a provider of specialty pharmacy and infusion services. They started out and are dedicated to the mission of providing innovative healthcare solutions. And what are they doing regarding COVID-19? Their clinical experts and compliance team leaders are working diligently to stay informed on the evolving local and national COVID-19 situation, which you'll hear more about in just a moment, all of the research and up-to-date information that Elizabeth has. To address unmet needs and to expand access to care, OptiMed has launched a drive-through COVID testing program. So far, they've serviced over 15,000 local community members. They also offer a growing number of ambulatory and home infusion services as an option to minimize the risk of COVID exposure for patients needing infusion therapy during the pandemic. We are so pleased to introduce one of OptiMed's pharmacists, Elizabeth Davenport. From specialty medication counseling and rare disease management to immunizations, obviously the topic of the day, and a comprehensive COVID-19 response, OptiMed's pharmacists are supporting patients' health and well-being. Elizabeth received her doctorate of pharmacy from Butler University, completed her postgraduate residency training from Walgreens and Purdue University. Okay, with that, welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk with you all today. A little bit more just about me and my passion around immunizations. Part of my postgraduate residency actually looked at employer-based on-site vaccine clinics. So I have a special place in my heart for, going on-site to a lot of places like where you work and providing immunizations, as well as some experience with some multiple dose regimen vaccines and in recent past. So we'll talk more about how that relates to the specific COVID vaccine candidates, but I am very excited to talk with you all today. So
Elizabeth, can you start off by just explaining to me and all of all the folks listening, how does this vaccine actually work?
That's a great question. So I think to explain how it works, we should go through the first couple slides. To answer that question, just want to focus on high-level background information, as well as some terminology that'll be used when vaccines specifically the COVID vaccines, are discussed in the media, on the news. Just kind of want like some things to think about as you're watching developments go on. And I recognize that this graphic is kind of cartoony, but I think it demonstrates some key points well. So understanding immunity, this is from the World Health Organization. You know, pathogens, existing pathogens you see, measles, chickenpox, flu. You know, pathogens can be anything like bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungus that can cause disease in humans. Our body recognizes pathogens as antigens. So when you hear the word antigen, it's just part of the pathogen. If our immune system already has an antibody to that antigen that it can recognize, it can mount an immune response and, you know, basically fight off that infection, usually before it actually causes damage to the body. When humans don't have an antibody to a new pathogen, it has to create new antibodies. So if we don't have like a specific protection to COVID-19 at this point. So how vaccines produce immunity, also from the World Health Organization. So this slide defines a vaccine in a very basic sense, a little bit different than the current candidates, which we'll discuss. But it's still a good way to think of vaccines. So, you know, a vaccine introduces that new pathogen to the body without imposing a risk of the disease caused by the pathogen. So the vaccine stimulates the immune system to recognize that pathogen, create antibodies to it, exactly like if you would be exposed to the disease, but without the concern and potential complications of the disease itself. So this gets into some of those vaccine terminology, and this is where I'll answer that question. So this slide specifically talks about vaccine terminology. The next slide talks about some COVID-19 terms. But let's see here. So the first term listed is booster. Booster is defined as an additional dose of a vaccine that's needed periodically to, in theory, boost the immune system. So a good example of a booster is a tetanus vaccine. It's recommended for adults every 10 years. This is not the same as when you're hearing in the news of like the COVID vaccines require 2 doses. It's not a booster. It's actually something called a primary series, which it's kind of hard if you should try to like Google primary series. You wouldn't necessarily find a quick and easy answer to that term, which is why, you know, I listed resources at the bottom of every slide as far as where the information comes from. Vast majority of it is the CDC and FDA. Primary series, what that term means is the number of doses, especially if it requires more than 1 dose of a vaccine to provide immunity. A good example of like a primary series is for a child, tetanus. Tetanus has a booster, but initial vaccination for tetanus is several series, usually started in childhood. You call that the primary series. It has several vaccines that are required, all the same vaccine, the tetanus. But then later in life, you require a booster to, again, boost the immune system's response because it's been studied that that immunity wanes over time. So not the same thing when we're talking about the 2-dose series of the COVID vaccines, a little bit different. So I did want to put that out there. Live attenuated vaccine and inactivated vaccine. These are not currently COVID-19 vaccine candidates, but I did want to put, you know, context around what these are versus what we're looking at for COVID-19. So a live attenuated vaccine is also just known as an attenuated vaccine. So this is a vaccine where a live virus is what they call attenuated, which means weakened. So it's a weakened virus, but it is a live virus. And the virus is used in order to produce an immune response that doesn't cause like severe effects of the disease. So there's several vaccines that are considered to be live attenuated vaccines in the United States, things like measles, mumps, rubella. There are some flu, very flu and nasal flu, but the chickenpox vaccine is this type of vaccine, as well as some others. Then there's the inactivated vaccine. This is the vaccine that we think of as like the dead virus. So it's made from a virus or a bacteria that's been killed, either like through various mechanisms, but it does not cause disease. And this is like the vast majority of the flu vaccines. For example, there are others as well. Also, something that's not on here, but is still something to keep in mind when we talk about any vaccine, especially when you're hearing in the news discussion about COVID-19 vaccines, is the word titer. Titer is the detection of antibodies in the blood that are found through a lab test. So when we're measuring how much antibody is present in the body after you've mounted an immune response, you would hear the word titer. It's basically the same thing as like you're just measuring how much antibody you have. So specifically the COVID-19 vaccine candidates. So this goes to your initial question, Rebecca, but the candidates that are on the forefront, which we'll talk further, in the slides, more details about, but just defining them as a whole, are mRNA-based and adenovirus-based vaccines. The two that are most likely candidates, the ones that have the most traction as of right now, are both mRNA-based vaccines. So we're going to focus talking much more about them than the adenovirus, but we will also talk about adenovirus. So the mRNA, there's a lot to unpack here. So M stands for messenger, so it's messenger RNA. Messenger RNA is something that is naturally found in the human body. It's actually something that when it's naturally found in the body, it is utilized. It goes between your actual DNA in your cell, and it is then sent to a different part of the cell that makes proteins. And mRNA are the actual instructions from your DNA that says, make this protein that we need to have life, because proteins are essential, serve essential functions for life. So there is, when we talk about mRNA-based vaccines, though, how that works is that we are taking instructions that create a protein that are specific for COVID-19, a protein that is expressed on the COVID-19 virus, introducing it to the body so that it never actually gets to our DNA in our cell, but how it works is that that little bit of our mRNA will go into the human cell. It will be utilized in that one part of the cell that actually makes proteins. It will be utilized by that part of the cell to make what's called, or what's being discussed as a spike protein. So if you hear spike protein, specifically, it's a protein that is found on the COVID-19 virus that's expressed. If you want to think about that antigen picture previously, it's that kind of idea that it can be recognized that's specific to COVID-19. So after the human cell actually produces that spike protein, the cell will, first of all, our cells are really smart, and it will actually break down that mRNA and get rid of it. There's a lot of ways that our cells break down mRNA after they're done using those instructions. So it gets rid of that mRNA, and then that spike protein that the cell made that's specific to COVID-19 actually gets put on the surface of the cell. And at that point, that's when your immune system recognizes, hey, this is not normal. This is not supposed to be here. And that's when the immune system actually mounts a response and starts to fight off that invader and then produce that antibody response, producing those antibodies. So at a high level, that's what mRNA-based vaccines are. The benefit of mRNA vaccines, like all vaccines, is that, again, you're getting vaccinated and gaining protection from COVID-19 without having to, risk the complications and consequences of getting sick with COVID-19 first. So then when we talk about adenovirus-based vaccines, these are adenoviruses as a whole. So backing up, adenoviruses are a group of common viruses that can infect like various parts of the body, including like the lungs. These adenoviruses as a whole are very common. So a lot of the population already has existing immunity to adenoviruses as like a whole. So the idea behind the adenovirus-based vaccine is that the vaccine's made from an adenovirus. You might hear it called a carrier virus or a vector vaccine. Those are all the same idea, but specifically the vaccine is made from a carrier virus, which is the adenovirus. And this virus, the adenovirus, has been engineered to carry a specific gene from the COVID-19 virus. Kind of the same idea of like the mRNA. It has a gene that then the body would create antibodies to specifically the COVID-19 part to then have antibodies specific to COVID-19, but it's just being used and carried into the body by the adenovirus. The concern with this type of virus, which we'll speak a little bit more to as we go forward, is that because it's carried by the adenovirus, the concern is that you might actually see that it elicits more of a response of like prior immunity to the adenovirus without making as much specific antibodies to COVID-19. That's that genetic material that's inserted into the adenovirus. So next slide, please. A lot of these terms on COVID-19 terminology are very common already, but I thought just to be complete, it would be worthwhile to discuss this. So viruses and the diseases they cause often have different names. So when you're hearing in the news the SARS-CoV-2, this is the specific virus. It was named by the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses. They named it back February 11th of 2020. The name was chosen because the virus is genetically related to the coronavirus that was responsible for the SARS outbreak in 2003, but the viruses are different, so that's why you have that very specific name. Just recognize that when you see that, it is the same idea as COVID-19, it's just specifically the virus that causes it. And then COVID-19 is, of course, the disease that is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Diseases are named separate, and they're actually named by the World Health Organization because of their role related to prevention, discussing prevention, spread, severity, treatment. It was also named on the same day, February 11, 2020. When we hear about COVID-19, there was a lot of discussion, especially earlier on in the pandemic, about MIS or MIS-C, which is the multi-system inflammatory syndrome. When it's specifically found in children, that's when that C gets added on. The understanding is that this is a condition that usually has been seen in children, but it's a condition where different body parts can become inflamed, specifically, all of the major players, your heart, lungs, kidneys, brain, intestines. The cause is unknown, but many kids with MIS-C had COVID-19 or had a known exposure to someone with COVID-19. It can be very serious, even life-threatening, but with early detection and medical intervention, the vast majority of children improved. And like long-term outcomes are currently unknown, but when we talk about some like serious complications of COVID-19, this is something that's often discussed and you might see discussed, especially as COVID-19 vaccine trials start being discussed in relation to children. Friendly reminder when we're talking about vaccines and the COVID-19 vaccine, we're not going to focus on this very much because I know the vast majority of you interact with adults as far as your employees go, but children require some additional considerations. As much as it's hard to think that they're not little adults, their bodies are not the same as adults as far as how medications work, and vaccines are medications, so there's some additional considerations. So you might see this being discussed going forward as a concern of something that's being tracked, I guess, with COVID-19 vaccines, the incidence of it, because it is a severe complication potential. Herd immunity. So herd immunity is something that's being discussed a lot. This is also, you might hear community immunity, same concept. It's where a sufficient proportion of the population is immune to an infectious disease to make its spread from person to person unlikely. So again, a little cartoony from the World Health Organization, but herd immunity can be achieved via natural infection. So, when we're hearing that people have COVID-19, they do have, the understanding right now is some short-term immunity and protection because of that natural infection and the immune response that their bodies actually had to the infection. So either through the infection itself or through a vaccine, an individual is protected. However, there's a concern that there's certain pockets of the population that can't be vaccinated for a variety of different reasons, which we can discuss further. But the concept of herd immunity being, if enough people get vaccinated, you can protect the vulnerable, or otherwise those that can't be vaccinated. And this number is changing, and I put a disclaimer that this number, depending on where you look, this number is different. But general consensus in the medical community is that something around 70% of the population would need to be vaccinated or have some sort of immunity to COVID-19 before herd immunity is achieved. And this has been discussed when we think about various countries and locations that have been really hard hit early on in the pandemic. This was discussed in New York City, for example, through natural infection. Again, though, related to vaccines in particular, natural infection, as we've seen in different populations across the country and across the world, you have the higher risk of severe illness and death, whereas with vaccination, that risk is much, much lower, significantly lower.
So, Elizabeth, I'm just going to jump in with another question, which I know you're prepared to answer. Actually, I'm going to preview the question after that too. So, and then believe me, we're going to get to the participant questions as well. But the two burning questions on my mind and on lots of people's minds are safety and timing, right? And regarding safety, one of the key questions seems to be this was approved fairly quickly. And I'm saying that as someone that has no previous knowledge of what the approval process is, but we keep hearing on the news how quickly this was developed and approved. So I am very curious about your expertise on the approval process and how it worked with the COVID-19 vaccines. And then after that, we're going to ask you to get into the timing, right? Like when can I actually get this vaccine and when can my employees? So can you start with the vaccine approval process?
Yes. So I think in order to really highlight the differences and the question itself, which is the concern about safety because this is an emergency use authorization is what's being sought. I think it's really important to understand what normally goes into the typical vaccine approval process to then understand what those differences are. So first, this is a very brief overview of like what that process looks like on the current slide, but there's a lot that goes into it. So the first part, R&D, this is done in a lab. The key part of this is just testing the idea if a vaccine could potentially be a candidate for a disease. Then it goes into the preclinical stage, which is sometimes called phase 0, which is where, again, it's done in a lab. But there's testing done in animals to see, specifically looking at safety, see if it works, but gather information if it would be safe in humans before actually utilizing it, doing any studies on human participants. Then you go into the clinical development stage, which is the vast majority of this process. Clinical development is phase 1, 2, and 3. So during phase 1, you have a small group of healthy people, usually somewhere between like 20 to 100 people that receive the trial vaccine. The number one focus of this is safety. Gathering some early information about how well the vaccine works to actually induce an immune response, but really it's about safety. So in the absence of safety concerns from phase 1, you go on to phase 2 trials. And in phase 2, the clinical study group is expanded to include people who might actually have characteristics like age, physical health, like those for whom like the new vaccine would be intended. So first phase, healthy people. Second phase, it could, for vaccine, it's a little bit harder. Usually it's still healthy people. But in this mirrors also a lot of what is, actually it mirrors exactly what is done with just general drug approval as a whole. It's just vaccines are unique, so they have a different area of the FDA that specifically focuses on them. So all that said, phase 2, this is where you're looking at different dosages of the vaccine to test to see if there's a relationship between the dose that's given and the immune response that's actually seen. The focus of this phase is still safety. So you're looking for safety, especially common side effects and risks, as well as some initial effectiveness data, but the really key part of this still is safety. You might also see in phase 2 that there are a group of controls. So what we think of as the placebos, people that don't actually get the vaccine, to compare as far as, especially again, when we think about safety, did those people experience the same side effects? Did they not? How did they compare? So in lieu, again, of safety concerns, it goes on to phase 3, which is where this is given, the vaccine is given to thousands of people and tested for effectiveness and safety compared to a control group, so your placebos. And this is randomized control studies. So when we think in the medical community, a randomized control study is the gold standard of ensuring quality as well as reducing bias. So the focus of this phase is effectiveness. And actually, from a safety concern, this phase is also trying to identify some of those less common side effects that were not found in phase 2 to more understand what can be expected from a safety standpoint when given to a much more diverse, large group of people, since it is thousands of people that are receiving the vaccine at this phase. All the while during these phases, there's something happening at the FDA. They're focusing on manufacturing. So while the vaccine is being tested, the FDA is assessing information about the manufacturing of the vaccine and the facility where it will be made. The FDA requires vaccine manufacturers submit data to support manufacturing procedures, the facilities, the characterization of the product, as well as they have to demonstrate lot-to-lot consistency. So manufacturers make vaccines and drugs as a whole in batches that they call lots. So they have to show the FDA that from, each batch of vaccine that they're creating, it's consistent, it's the same, which then again just goes to show that when those vaccines are being utilized and studied in humans, that you're having the same response, the same exact product being utilized across the board to show that there's not inconsistencies, especially when we think about safety. So the last part of this is the regulatory review and approval, which is the BLA submitted to FDA, the big yellow on the screen. So once a manufacturing process is developed, you ensure the vaccine can be produced reliably and consistently, and the preclinical and the clinical development programs have been successfully completed, so everything has been done. That's when a company submits a biologics license application, or a BLA, to the FDA. So the BLA is a comprehensive submission that's submitted to the FDA. It includes all the information, including all the information from the phase 3 trials. Note, something I do want to make sure I note is that the final published phase 3 data is available before the BLA is submitted to the FDA. And that is key when we talk about the differences. So the BLA has all the phase 3 data when it's evaluating the vaccine. So by submitting a BLA to the FDA, a company is seeking permission to distribute and market a vaccine for use in the United States. It evaluates the data, it evaluates the manufacturing. After its evaluation, the FDA decides whether to approve it, which is also known as licensing. So if you hear approve or license, it's the same thing. If the FDA approves the vaccine, the company is permitted to market it. It will make its decision based on the analysis of the benefits and risks for the intended population who received the vaccine. The FDA also works collaboratively to evaluate all the scientific data and information included in the BLA when it's making the determination to approve a vaccine. This team consists of a ton of different people, from physicians, chemists, toxicologists, microbiologists, manufacturing facility inspectors, labeling experts. follows the whole gambit, and those people are still involved in the emergency use evaluation. So it's still utilizing a huge range of expertise when evaluating the product. And in some cases, the FDA will actually seek input from a specific committee internally that looks at a panel of outside independent technical experts, which is also something to kind of keep in mind, that it's not just within the government. They actually utilize outside individuals to double check the work, basically, is how you can think about it. And then from a quality control standpoint, this is looking at ongoing monitoring of safety and effectiveness, which is kind of what you can think of as phase 4 on the slide. So after something has actually been approved, it's important. The FDA recognizes that a vaccine is a drug, and like any drug, vaccines have benefits and risks. And even when they're highly effective, no vaccine is 100% effective in preventing disease, and it's not 100% safe in all individuals. Most side effects of vaccines are short-lived, but they have a very rigorous process for evaluation of ongoing surveillance of vaccines after FDA approval, specifically looking to identify uncommon side effects or long-term complications that can occur. So FDA often requires manufacturers to conduct post-marketing studies to further assess known or potential serious risks, which is what that phase 4 is located. So it's ongoing data collection, monitoring, and part of that is also the FDA has a system. They have various systems actually, but the most well-known for closely monitoring side effects, not adverse reactions, but it's called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, V-A-E-R-S. So if you see that, it's utilized to gather information about safety that is utilized in that phase 4 trial, post-marketing. There's also ongoing, just to keep note, there's ongoing analysis of lots where just because during the initial process, the manufacturer showed the FDA that the lots, the batches were consistent, they have to continue to do so. So they continue to look at purity, potency, the identity, the sterility, and they can't release those batches until the FDA says, yep, everything looks good. So there's ongoing evaluation for safety and even after the approval. So that's the normal standard process. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is a vaccine approval with an emergency use evaluation, which is what the FDA has built in for really emergencies. So I recognize that this slide is full of words. This is intentional. It's taken directly from the FDA's website, and I think that it holds some really key information that I'm mostly just going to speak to. I'm not going to read directly from it. But an emergency use authorization, or EUA, which you're seeing a lot in the news, is a way to facilitate the use and availability of unapproved products like vaccines during public health emergencies like the pandemic we're currently in, when there's no other alternatives. Like that's the key. If there's no other alternatives, that's where you start to see an EUA presented. So for an EUA, the manufacturer must provide manufacturing information to ensure quality. So all the information that's required in the regular vaccine approval process is still required. All the manufacturing is exactly the same. It's just, instead of it being a BLA that's submitted to the FDA, it's being put in the EUA. But all the same manufacturing to ensure that the batches are consistent, it's safe, it's sterile, it's, the potency is correct. All of that is still the exact same. From a safety data standpoint, and this, if you're trying to read on the slide, this is like the second paragraph. The FDA has said that for an emergency use authorization to be granted, there's a couple of hard stops for them. So for phase 1 and 2 trials, a difference between the regular process and an EUA is that at least 2 months of follow-up after completing the full vaccine regimen has to be available for analysis. And for phase 3, the FDA expects that more than 3,000 people will have at least 1 month of follow-up after the vaccine regimen is completed. So they're requiring, as a hard stop, they have to have that basic requirement met. I will say that from what is available currently, the 2 vaccines that are like top runner candidates have vast, way more numbers than that. So this is just the FDA saying, hard stop, you have to show us this much safety information and at least this much time of follow-up before we will consider your vaccine. If you're looking at the 3rd paragraph, so the EUA request is what is included usually in a BLA. So it needs sufficient data submitted. So the difference that is being noted, especially in the news, and I will put a huge caveat that, like, in the United States, there is, like, have not released this information. It's coming from, like, the UK because they just authorized emergency use authorization for Pfizer's drug yesterday. But they require that in order for an EUA in the United States to be approved, they would like all of the phase 3 clinical efficacy data, so all that effectiveness data, they would like all of it, but they will still consider an emergency use authorization if they can at least have a pre-specified success criteria. So just like part of the phase 3 trial, if they can have part of it and show that it's somewhat successful. Again, the key is they've already shown that it's safe because they're requiring robust safety data be submitted. It's the effectiveness that they're willing to take just like part of the data. And then again, the key with an EUA is that it's not technically licensed, it's emergency use authorization. There will be ongoing, just like with the regular vaccine, there will be ongoing, not really phase 4 because it's not quite the same, but basically phase 4 ongoing monitoring for safety and especially for effectiveness because, again, they don't necessarily require that all the final analysis of the phase 3 data be submitted. So I want to also kind of put this in some historical context. So when we think about vaccine trials prior to COVID-19, and this is not on the slide, but a big vaccine trial for like a phase 3 trial had like 10,000 people. So most vaccines as a whole show side effects within like 6 weeks of the dose. So when the FDA says for a EUA, you have to have at least 2 months of follow-up data from phase 3 trials, that's pretty consistent with what they've historically found to be the time window, 6 weeks versus they're requiring 8 weeks. That's pretty consistent as far as initial concerns of safety on a wide scale go. And also just kind of to keep in mind what you're going to see when the data is available is vaccine trials usually look like this. When they're looking at safety, they are going to, in a trial, have solicited questions about, 7 days after you got a dose, what side effects are you having? And then they're going to also follow up like 28 days after the vaccine is given. And then usually they're looking for especially serious side effects for at least 6 months after. So something to consider is that, especially for those phase 1 and 2 trials for the current candidates, you have at least 6 months data on those from a safety concern, which will be utilized when those EUAs are being evaluated, because it has been, it really has been usually somewhere around 6 months. So just kind of putting context around that. And I think the hard part about the vaccine too is that there's been a lot of politicalization on both sides of this. The point I want to bring to the FDA's process for the emergency use authorization is that politics does not change what the requirements are. So these are the requirements, and these are the basic requirements, and a lot of what is available to the public for those current vaccine candidates goes above and beyond what the basic requirements are, as far as especially safety.
Elizabeth, thank you. That is absolutely fascinating, and everything that I did not know about FDA approval of vaccines or medicines in general. Let's get to the timing question, because that
Yes.
is really important on everyone's mind. I know it's important on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
When can we expect to actually have the vaccine available? And I know that's a hard question, because we've heard just yesterday from the CDC that they are recommending, that we group people in terms of priority. So if you need to answer that question in terms of different, categories of individuals, that's fine. But can you let us know what your thoughts are on that?
This is something that was released end of November, and already there have been decisions made. On December 1st, the ACIP, which is the organization, so when should the FDA approve an emergency use authorization, before it can actually before you can do anything with it, the ACIP has to actually approve. They are the organization, the federal organization that actually says, this is the vaccine that's recommended. They have a ton of resources when it comes to vaccines as a whole. So they're the ones that actually are deciding where the vaccine is going first as far as allocation goes. So it says work group proposed. There has been a final decision as of December 1st for phase 1A, and it is healthcare providers and long-term care facilities, specifically the residents.
And when do we think they'll start having access to the vaccine?
Yes, it's a good question. So,
if you know.
So this is on a previous slide. So the anticipated date of if an EUA is granted for the two leading candidates, which is the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, the decision could be made as early as December 10th. And as is in the news, there is Operation Warp Speed, which is going to get vaccine where the federal government decides to allocate it to the states. Then the states are going to allocate it to various facilities to actually administer it to these specific individuals, these groups. It could be in December. There's no actual information specifically out there, but to say that it could happen before 2020 is over is very likely should an EUA be authorized. And I do want to say should an EUA be authorized because we are in a pandemic. The data that is out there, especially from a safety perspective, is robust, but that information is not easily accessible to the public. Like, we will not see what we normally see until the EUA is authorized, as far as like, this is all the information that was sent to the FDA. And the FDA does have a different process. It is very similar to the UK, but the FDA is known for very high standards of authorization for medications. Worldwide, we are kind of the snobs as far as what our standards are. So even in a pandemic, I do want to make that point. It has to be authorized first. But should that happen, you could easily see this starting in December. If you want to go to the next, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just looking at your slide, which is very interesting to me, especially that second block, that phase 1B essential workers, because that goes to one of the questions we received for you from an employer who is in an essential construction for housing service and wants to know when their employees would be eligible for the vaccine. So would that go to the phase 1B essential workers group?
Yeah, it really would actually. So this is the hard thing. So I know a lot of questions that were presented from the group had to do with, you know, can my business, you know, provide the vaccine on site? And the hard part about these phases too is that right now, as it stands, the government, this will be government allocated. So it will, for the foreseeable future, be the government that is distributing and allocating the vaccine. So I would say that in this essential workers bucket, like from what's listed here on the slide, firefighters, police, utilities, it's most likely going to go to anyone that I would argue, and this is a speculation, but I would argue it would first, because of ease of administration, go to those kinds of essential workers that have some sort of connection or are, you know, run by the government, because it is government allocated. I would foresee in phase 1B, the first of those essential workers are going to be specifically related to the government. Not to say that, as you know, a commercial group that provides those services will not be part of this group. I think they will, but I think that there's a certain amount of time that each phase is being given, which actually, if you want to go to the next slide, I think it's kind of a good illustration of this point. This is a possible scenario of what it could look like for how much time we will spend in each phase. And there's huge caveats on this.
Right.
But because also you got to think that right now, and I know we skipped this, but the vaccine candidates require 2 doses, and the second dose is at 21 days or 28 days, depending on the vaccine. So there's inherently a 3 to 4 week built-in time period. So something to keep in mind is that in each phase, it is the plan from the government that you as an individual, if you are part of that group that receives vaccine, you are getting both doses before anyone else, before you go on to the next phase. So you are ensuring that you get both doses, and when those doses are allocated. So if you hear that somewhere in Southwest Michigan is getting 20,000 doses of one of the vaccines, 10,000 people are getting vaccinated, and that is a hard stop. So something to think about is that you're going to have to think about doses, cut it in half, and that's the actual number of people that are going to be vaccinated. And the hard thing about this too is that from a feasibility, which has been discussed in depth and will continue to be discussed, the different vaccines have some different requirements as far as how long they can be refrigerated and how many doses are in each vial. You might see doses wasted out of no fault of the individuals that are, you know, administering doses. It might just be a logistics problem. So even though you might see that so many people get so many doses, it might not actually, you might see that some of those are wasted. And all that said, just something to think about. So all that said, phase 1B is essential workers. And as you can see right now, it looks like it's going to be like a 10-week period, most likely. And I think that it's all essential workers. I just foresee the government being on the first side of that, if that is helpful.
Yep. And then 1C on your chart, which is awesome because it's, again, that timing question. 1C is high-risk individuals, right? So we're talking about folks at high risk to develop serious complications of COVID-19 if they contract it. So older adults, individuals with pre-existing conditions, that's the phase 1C, correct?
Yes. And I think something that's interesting about this chart that's pulled up currently is the doses per week increases when you get to 1C. And I think the speculation is that especially when we first start to roll out vaccine, there has been a huge push to make sure that manufacturing is supported by these drug companies so that they can send out vaccine. So I think the anticipation is that by the time we get to week, 15 of this push of making sure that it's accessible to the public, I think the idea is that there will be ramped up either, increased number of facilities, which again require oversight from the FDA, even with an emergency use authorization.
I see on your chart phase 2, that's the bucket that I'm going to put the rest of us in, folks that don't have high-risk jobs or high-risk health considerations. I see you are predicting that it's going to start somewhere around week 20 of the vaccine rollout, but I don't see an end date at that. What is your best guess? And again, we will not hold you to this because we know there's a lot of flux. But what is your best guess as to how long it will take to immunize the rest of us, keeping in mind, again, that it takes two visits to a healthcare provider to complete the immunization?
Sure. So I think the thing I can more easily answer is when it'll start. You could see it starting as early as mid-2021, I think is a reasonable expectation for the start. Something that is difficult to project is what the allocation of doses will look like at that point. So the initial phases, like I said, are government allocated. That could last through phase 2. I have no way to anticipate how long those doses will last as far as the number of people that are being vaccinated, what the loss is, or the waste is. So as far as what that phase 2 looks like and how people are going to get doses, it could still be government allocated. So that might mean that you're going to specific facilities that, the government, like the state government has allocated to local hospitals, drive-throughs, because there are a variety of different possibilities as far as where people could actually get vaccinated throughout all phases, whether it be a hospital, outpatient, pharmacy, even there's a consideration of drive-through potential options that are being looked at. So how those doses are going to be done is really hard. What I can speak to is that as far as tracking the 2 doses, there will be definitely a lot of push on the individual to ensure that they get their second dose when they're supposed to. So my hope is that wherever you receive your first dose, there will be a system in place for ensuring that your second dose basically has your name on it. From a pharmacy standpoint, there are examples of 2-dose vaccine regimens for adults. So a good example is a vaccine called Shingrix that was new here the last couple of years. And there was, it requires a second dose in a pretty big time window. And individuals, it was put on the responsibility of the individual to make sure that that second dose occurred. Something that you probably will see, unfortunately, I think it's just the reality of the situation once you get to phase 2, is that by that point, there will be a ton of data because so many people have been vaccinated that of what the concern is should you get your dose late. There will probably be a lot of data out there about, we see that it's really, really important that you have to get your dose at this, on the 21 or 28 days, or, hey, we found that you still have a really good protection. You just need to make sure that you get it at X number of days after that 21 or 28 days. You most likely will see that because so many people would have been vaccinated at that point.
So, Elizabeth, with our last remaining minute or two, let's get to the number one audience question that was asked several times and was on my mind as well. You mentioned place of delivery, right, in your last answer. So many employers want to know, at some point, is this the type of vaccine that can be offered on site at employers at a vaccine clinic, similar to how employers provide flu clinics these days? And if so, when do you expect that to be possible?
So first, it will depend on how far government allocated doses get, because when the government has the doses, it's not even a concern. If it gets to the point where it's, otherwise healthy individuals phase 2, you as an employer might not have to even pay for your employees' doses because the government is giving vaccine to providers free of charge. And the understanding now is that CMS is going to reimburse providers for administration, but it's not being billed. If it's government allocated, it's not being billed to you as the employer. So I think going forward, you could, long down the road, you could think about this being a potential. But something to consider, too, is that we won't know if this requires a booster. So if it should, I think that's kind of the area that you might see, like the flu clinics every year, people being able to come on site and administer vaccine. But for the initial series, the 2 doses, it could be a possibility. But really, that's long in the future a discussion.
Okay.
Probably past mid-2021.
You mentioned cost, so let me answer, and then we will let folks get on with their day. But let me answer one question that came in that's also been asked several times, and I will note is going to be answered much more exhaustively tomorrow by Tripp Vanderwall, who is one of our benefits lawyers here. But it was asked today, and I knew that Elizabeth would touch on cost, which is on everyone's minds. And the question is, will insurance companies, healthcare provided by employer insurance companies, be covering the cost of the vaccine? And the very short answer is that non-grandfathered group plans under the ACA will be required to pay for the vaccine and its administration without any participant cost sharing. Okay, that's the short answer. The flip of that is that grandfathered group healthcare plans under the ACA are not required to pay for the vaccine or its administration. And again, Tripp is going to get into a lot more detail on that tomorrow. We are also going to touch on some other questions that came in. We're going to touch on those tomorrow. Can it be mandated? Are there certain categories of employees or citizens where it will be mandated? Sarah and Tripp and folks will be talking about that tomorrow. 2 more questions to wrap up with, Elizabeth. One is, because this one's been asked several times as well, will the vaccine be recommended for people who have already had COVID-19? And then if you can wrap up with directing folks to sources of information that you trust as a medical professional for people that do have further questions about the vaccine.
Okay. So can you remind me the first question? Sorry.
First question, yes. If I've already had COVID-19,
yes,
should I still get the vaccine?
Yes. Good question. So this kind of goes to a slide that I wasn't able to talk about, but what's being looked at for effectiveness as far as in clinical trials. The understanding, again, this is not easily accessible to the public, but what is considered to be the primary endpoint the trials are looking at is if you've never had COVID before, what kind of protection does it give you? A secondary endpoint that is being evaluated is I've had COVID before, do I still have benefit? And what they're finding and what's being discussed is that, yes, there is still a benefit. So you have that short-term immunity from the infection itself, but our current understanding is that immunity does wane. So quick answer, yes. The understanding at the moment is yes, there would still be a benefit. Perfect. That's the quick answer. Perfect. And then resources.
Yes, resources.
Yes, for resources, something besides the FDA, of course, I would highly recommend, and it's at the very last slide for me, is ACIP. I believe it's the Advisory Committee, Immunization, Vaccines. It's ACIP. Again, it's one thing for the FDA to actually approve the vaccine. ACIP is the organization that, for example, if this does need a booster, if this primary series is not, it doesn't provide that long-term immunity, or the vaccine, what we find is that the virus, like the flu virus, mutates, which is why we have to do the flu vaccine every year, that organization is going to have a lot of good information related to that, as well as specifically the allocation of, as the phases continue to go on, they're the group that are going to actually be deciding who gets vaccine. So I would very much recommend following ACIP.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I feel like we could talk for 6 hours if we had it, but we don't. So Elizabeth, thank you very, very, very much for your expertise, and to OptiMed for all they're doing for the community during this pandemic. Stay tuned, or I should say tune back in, everyone, tomorrow morning at 8 for all of your legal questions regarding the vaccine. Thanks, and have a great day.